There are several stories in the Ukraine-Russian war. One being told in the Oval Office, a story in which Ukraine should trade land for time and trust that Moscow will stop at the line of contact that it's now got. The other being written in the mud of Kharkiv and along the prison corridors of occupied Donbass. A story of Russian forces overstretched, demoralized and presiding over territories they neither govern humanely nor secure convincingly. In Washington last week, President Trump urged President Zelensky to accept a land for peace bargain, reportedly tossing aside frontline maps and repeatedly talking about a call with President Putin, give up the Donbass, end the war or face destruction. And Putin, meanwhile, has gone on television lauding the acquisition of the Donbass territories. That's all the Donbass territories that he drafted into Russian land, into Russian law a few years ago. So it's not that he wants one particular area, Donetsk, and he's satisfied with that. That was the interpretation that I drew the other day. That's not true. That's not what he's saying to the Russian people. What he's saying to the Russian people is he's already got this land and he wants to keep it. So the episode has been robustly reported in Washington and Brussels about the Zelensky-Trump meeting, with Europe now scrambling to present a united counterweight and to advance plans that include some using income from frozen Russian assets. Trump later denied demanding the whole of Donbass and recast his position as a freeze along current lines. But the thrust is the same. Stop, lock in Russia's gains, talk later. The Kremlin tellingly has not endorsed even that freeze. And this is the capitulation script. It asks Ukraine to settle for a ceasefire that Moscow itself will not guarantee. It would bank Russian occupation without securing the people who live under it. Now, the counter story is this. Russian advances this year have been meagre relative to their cost. The Economist's current metrical analysis estimates territorial gains of roughly 0.4% for 2025, purchased at a staggering price in lives. Russia retains mass, but momentum is brittle. Operationally, Ukraine keeps innovating. In June, along the northeastern front, a small wheeled land robot costed by its unit at roughly $1,500, helped compel a Russian dugout to surrender. The 3rd Assault Brigade coordinated ground and aerial drones, detonated one robot inside the position, and then watched as 2 Russian soldiers emerged with a cardboard sign, "We want to surrender." It is the first documented case of enemy prisoners taken by a ground robot. This is not a fable. It is a filmed operation reconstructed by commanders and verified in open reporting. And the morale indicators line up. Ukraine's surrender hotline, "I Want to Live," has logged tens of thousands of contacts and mid-war spikes in applications. In multiple episodes during Ukraine's 2024 to 2025 cross-border pressure campaign, Russian conscripts, the least prepared rung of Moscow's 2-tier army, abandoned positions or surrendered in groups, a fact noted across outlets precisely because of its political bite back in Russia. This is the tactical reality. A larger invader, bleeding for inches, facing an opponent that keeps finding asymmetric ways to husband manpower and erode the illusion of inevitability. Even if one brackets territory and looks only at people, the bargain on offer from Russia is rotten. The human rights record in occupied Donbass since 2014 is grim and sustained. Censorship, secret detention sites such as the Izolyatsiya complex, torture, show trials. Former detainees, UN bodies and field researchers have documented beatings, electric shocks, torture, forced re-registration of religious groups, and the systematic choking of independent media. These practices are not incidental, they are structural, the habits of proxy administrations that answer upward, not outward. If this is what Russia is offering in occupied Ukraine, why would anyone accept that? Why would Trump accept that? So when the Freeze Now lobby says leave it as it is for the moment, it is asking Ukrainians to legitimize an environment that already violates the most basic civil protections, with no mechanism to reverse those harms later. A ceasefire line becomes not a pause, but a pipeline. New passports, new school books, new arrests. And let's be blunt, a freeze along the present front would validate Russia's method, to seize territory, to terrorize civilians into silence, then present your gains as the starting point for pragmatism. It would remove urgency for Moscow to negotiate seriously, because the fruits of aggression would already be in hand. Note that even this favourable freeze does not yet attract a Russian commitment. It strands civilians behind the line under the very abuses that I've catalogued. UN rapporteurs have warned with specificity about sexual torture, arbitrary detentions, and deaths in custody in occupied areas. Those risks don't evaporate with a handshake. By contrast, a credible pathway that increases pressure on Moscow, sustained European arms and financing, long-range strike enablers that degrade Russia's deep rear, and legal financial methods that turn frozen assets into structural reparation-backed loans, changes incentives without asking Ukraine to amputate parts of itself. European capitals are now openly discussing parts of that package. Morale is not a soft metric, it is a strategic resource. The videos of conscripts pleading, "Do not shoot, we are draftees," the filmed robot-induced surrender, the cues for the hotline, these cut two ways. Inside Russia, they sap the narrative that this is a tidy, antiseptic operation. Inside Ukraine, they reinforce that resistance is not futile, that ingenuity can offset mass. A settlement that writes off populations in Donetsk and Luhansk would invert that lesson and reward the very practices that produced the abuses we've seen since 2014. Now, none of this argues for a war without end. It argues against confusing capitulation with peace. A ceasefire worth having would be one that is monitored, underwritten by real costs for further violations, and paired with conditions that protect civilians, including access for monitors, exchange for detainees, and rolling human rights benchmarks tied to sanctions relief. Until then, banking the front line is not ending the killing, it is relocating it out of sight. In Washington, the argument is that Ukraine cannot win back territory, so it should negotiate first, verify later. In the field, the evidence is that Russia cannot convert mass into decisive gains, cannot fully secure its own border, and cannot govern its conquests without cruelty. That is not a platform from which to demand concessions. It's a warning that concessions will be pocketed and tested for more. The conclusion here is to call the bluff. Support a ceasefire only as part of an enforceable architecture that protects people, not lines on a map. Keep pressure where it changes minds in Moscow, on logistics, revenue and legitimacy, rather than on Kyiv. The war's two stories are not equal. One asks Ukraine to trust a promise that has never been kept. The other shows daily that an invader with dwindling returns and a failing custodianship of Donbass is not owed the prize of recognition. That is the contrast, and that is the case that can be made with a straight face and a clear conscience. Russia is bad under Putin, and Ukraine is good under Zelensky. That is a simple statement of fact. It's not about weighing up one against the other and saying, oh, there's offences on both sides, this is a war. But it's about saying there is one side which is fundamentally wrong, and that manifests in many different aspects, not only in the conduct of the war itself, which is appalling by Russia, but in the conduct of its occupation of the land that it's got, which is appalling. And of course in the morale of the soldiers, who are expected to risk their lives for their motherland, and they don't want to. And that tells us something as well, doesn't it?